And at this time, we would like to invite Rabbi Rokie Bernstein to the Bema to deliver a special Dvar Torah this morning. I'm told tying in the themes of the upcoming holiday of Pesach and also this auspicious and special occasion of honoring her good friend and ours, Rabbi Alan Green. Rabbi Bernstein, take it away.
Actually, I wanted to give a few words of introduction. You may not all be familiar with Rokie, although her reputation does precede her. Today being a special Shabbat, I thought it would be appropriate for Rokie to deliver this morning's Dvar Torah. Rokie is a native Winnipegger who currently resides in Vancouver, and she is a Magidic rabbi, which is to say a rabbi whose ministry is focused on teaching and storytelling. In Eastern Europe, a Magid typically would travel from town to town and synagogue to synagogue, and having no fixed address, a Magid could offer the isolated Jewish villages of Poland and Russia a deeper, broader perspective than what might otherwise be possible. The role of a modern Magidic rabbi isn't dissimilar. Rabbi Rokie's pulpit is wherever she happens to be. Her congregation is whoever happens to be with her. And since Rabbi Rokie constantly travels the world, both her teachings and her students are incredibly diverse. Rabbi Rokie's extensive background in business, psychology, and spiritual study allows her to deeply impact the hearts and souls of her students wherever they may be found. And I must add, like Joseph in the Bible, Rabbi Rokie is a gifted dreamer and an interpreter of dreams. Let us now welcome Rabbi Rokie Bernstein. That's your mic.
Shalom. 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 Let me find this magic spot here. Okay. Here we are. All right. Just recently recovering from cataract surgery, so I'm going to read my little notes, maybe. And I have a time on this, as always, because I love to tell stories. So the reason that I'm going to change this Dvar Torah a little bit and yet put it into where we are today is because I want to bring it up to the year 2018. So I'm going to start off by reminding you that one of the great people in the past of our history was the Baal Shem Tov, and we have many Baal Shem Tov stories that we tell. One of my very favorite is called the Baal Shem Tov going into the forest. Now, there's been a bloodletting, and the Jews have been blamed, and they're all going to be somewhat chastised severely. So the Baal Shem Tov goes into this magic place. He takes three, one at a time, he takes three of his disciples with him. And this disciple in particular that goes with him follows the Baal Shem Tov into the forest. They go into the forest. The Baal Shem Tov snaps his fingers just over a bush, and all of a sudden there's light, and that shows the way. And he goes to a way, and when he finds exactly the right way, he starts with his prayers, and he prays all day, all night, all day. And all of a sudden, as if he has a magic sign inside of him, he stops. He says, "It will be fine." He walks silently back to the village, saying a few more prayers, and all is fine. The next generation, his disciple encounters another bloodletting. All he remembers to do is what the Baal Shem Tov has done. He gets to the forest, he remembers that, but he doesn't remember where the bush is. He remembers some of the prayers, but not all the prayers. He does what he can. He goes back to the village, all is saved. The third time round, a next generation, next gentleman goes, doesn't remember that there's the forest in particular, but figures the forest will do. He walks into the forest. He can't remember the words. He can't remember the bush, but he can remember as far as he's supposed to go. He says the little prayers as best as he can make them up, and he goes back. Now we come to the fourth generation, the last generation. This generation, we have another thing that is going to be a big devastation to the Jewish people. Nonetheless, in goes the representative of the moment, which would be one of the Baal Shem Tov's relatives about 4 generations down. And he goes in, and he knows nothing, but what he says is, "I will tell you the story of what our ancestors did, the Baal Shem Tov and his 3 disciples, and that will have to serve." And in fact, the story itself, without all of the details, just telling the story served, and the Jews were saved. So what is it about telling a story that is so important? Why tell a story? We tell stories because they remind us not only of our history in its physical sense, but they remind us of our emotional story that we have carried through diaspora after diaspora after diaspora. And what are we talking about here? We are talking about exodus. Now, if that isn't a diaspora, I do not know what is. An entire grouping of people picked up and moved to many, many other parts of the world, never to see or meet each other again, to have to figure out a new way of living. Well, how did this all happen in actual fact? It all happened because Moses decided. Decided? Really? Was his destiny? Perhaps. At any rate, through the long story of Moses, and you've had it carried through the synagogue, through several of the parshas over the last weeks, Moses became the leader. He became the conduit for the Exodus. An Exodus always happens when there is an overgreat amount of chaos that must be rebalanced into a sense of order. And for whatever reason, in the grand scheme of life, Moses chose and was chosen to lead the people out of Egypt. Now, deciding and getting the Pharaoh and the people themselves together for all of that to happen was no small trick, as you know, just simply by reading the story of Exodus. But as long as we remember the story of Exodus, even in its major parts, we will begin to see that something begins to develop of the way an exodus is made. It's not a pilgrimage in itself, because in a pilgrimage, you know where you are going, and you are going to make specific sacrifices. The Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israeli people, called by many names during those several pharaohs who had gone from the grandeur of Joseph down to being the slaves of the Egyptians, they were living a chaotic life that had nothing to do with the life they wished to live. They needed to be moved on in history and time. Moses came along through the slave and through the parts and pieces that he had with the Pharaoh. He, in the end, was able to get the Pharaoh to let the people go, but it was all through a matter of conniving and God and arrangements and rearrangements and signs put on to keep firstborn going. And as the rabbi talked about today, the waters will always pass. The waters will always make a path when you are on your way, and particularly when it is the right way to go. So everything fell in line, and as we know the story, the people got out and they got into the center and they got to be with the Midianites and they got to Mount Sinai and they got Moses to climb up, and then they lost their faith. Now we come to the point of the story. This is the point of the story. When Moses went up to talk to God and God wrote the commandments the first time, he left in charge people who were going to keep the faith of monotheism. But the people themselves, not too long out of Egypt, still remembered Egypt, and they didn't like all of this, and they didn't like that they didn't have something specific to worship, and so they created the golden calf, and we know that it got destroyed and the people got destroyed. But what was the point of all of that? The point with all of that was that people have to have something, especially in a transition from order to chaos, to have faith in. That was the point of the whole story. In order to make this transition, in order for the people to believe in monotheism, in Moses, and that they were the carriers of this holy tale, they themselves had to come to some sense of faith and what they believed in about Hashem. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that there are archetypal, meaning basic patterns to people's lives. This wasn't the first time that people were cast out. Remember, there was paradise. Life was great in paradise, then it got a little chaotic with Eve and the worm, and the next thing you know, the people are out, they're out on a journey, and they don't get back they're not back there in paradise yet. Several paradises claimed around the world, but they're still not there yet. So from the old chaos to the new order, something was required. And what was required was a conduit who could hold the energy, because after all, we had a generation who only knew Egypt. We had a generation who had come out of Egypt under Mount Sinai, but they couldn't quite see the future. They couldn't remember the past like their parents. They were in between. They didn't quite know what to do. They only knew they didn't want to go back. Therefore, the only way seemed forward in a way that they could possibly do it. And After Moses got rid of what he thought of were the non-believers, they went forward. Now, when I thought of this, and I was thinking that this was the day that I would come and tell a story, I was thinking that really and truly, without the grandiosity, but truly the basis of life, we have here one of the greatest examples right here from my friend, Rabbi Alan Green, of what Exodus really is required. Because Rabbi Green, for the last 18 plus years, has been the Moses of this synagogue. He has taken us from the fundamentalist way necessary at the time that this synagogue, when it opened, and I was here, 1950, 3 years old, in the chapel, very, 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 it wasn't Orthodox. It was highly conservative. It had no music. It had little dance, had a great choir up there, but no song, no, we would have often said the prayers got to be on the floor. People lost interest in finding the deeper meaning of their lives. Rabbi Green kept the faith. For 18 years, Rabbi Green has been the Moses of this community. He has been the person who saw the chaos. He has saw the person who has tried various ways to bring it into line in order with what he felt was coming. I have a great deal of respect for Rabbi Green, not only for all of the things that he has done for my community, the synagogue, the world community, but the fact that he himself has been able through all of this, not only to hold his faith so purely in Judaism, but to embrace all of the faiths around the world and say, we are a loving community. We need unconditional love. We need to appreciate in people what is much more than all we do today, which is minding what isn't. So I don't know if my time is quite up, but it must be getting there. So I would like to say that in actual fact, why we tell these stories is because they contain the basic patterns of our lives. And the story of Moses, the story of Alan Green, is the story of all great people who have something that they believe in and are willing to give something of themselves in order to see change made. So from the bottom of my heart and my family's heart, I thank Rabbi Green for being part of the synagogue and mostly for bringing the synagogue into the 21st century with all of the complaining that went on. Because here we are with a wonderful crowd, a fabulous new cantor and rabbi ordained from our own communities. That is a most amazing thing. It hasn't happened yet in most of Canada at all. So, Yasher Koach to Rabbi Green.
Thank you.
And to the community who has supported him, and I hope will continue to take his work forward and allow the century to unfold into the future instead of falling back into the past. Please, just remember this story. Toda Rabbah.
Well done.
Yeah, good.
Well done. Well done. Thank you. Yeshua Koach.